I don't know how to turn it off.
Do you not know how? I don't put those on because I have trouble turning all those off.
Yeah.
But today we're going to be talking about emergency funds. And I think you said just how big of a panic cushion you kind of want, right?
Right, right. It's definitely not as fun as a whoopee cushion, but it'll make you feel better and give you a little relief if you have a panic cushion, something to cushion you, to make you fall down to earth a little bit easier when things go crazy. And my cat is eating something.
Exactly. I'm Michelle, and Michelle and Tina's show here. And apparently, is that Buddha that's
No,
there?
that's Finn.
Ben. Okay. Um, it's we didn't put his picture up here, but he can definitely join in today. One of the things that I thought I like to always put a quote at the beginning to kind of set the mood. And this one was from Dave Ramsey, and it says, "An emergency fund turns a crisis into an inconvenience." And I think that's a good way of putting it, because we tend to think of this emergency fund that's going to save us, and it's not fun to put those things aside. It's not fun to have to save up for an emergency. I would rather, buy something with those funds or take a vacation. But it does turn that crisis into an inconvenience for us. Even though we don't like it, it's not going to be such detriment on our finances. But the problem we always look at is understanding really the reason why we're saving up for that. Why save for it? Especially if you're starting out trying to either just starting a budget and really trying to, start building a retirement, or even trying to pay off debt. And that's the one I think we see the most, is that people are so focused on paying debt off that they want to like really dump every extra dollar that they have into that. And we often see that can hiccup, because that leaves them with nothing really to fall back onto. And in theory, it ends up setting them back even further. And it
I
just
think
it's oh, go
I
ahead.
they see their debt, if they're knowing that they have this debt and they keep seeing it, and then they have this emergency fund, they're just like, if I just dipped into that, then I would be okay, which is what some people do with retirement as well. But if we keep our money separate and keep it for where it is, then that makes sense. You just have to get over that feeling of it's for something else. And I think, did you have an example of that?
Absolutely. We had someone come in for financial coaching, and once we looked at what they were doing, it seemed like they were pretty much already on that path. And so there, other than just being like an accountability coach, if you will, there really wasn't more that we could add at that point. Now, once they got further along, we could definitely kind of help guide the new staff coming in, but not necessarily with what they were doing. They were tracking all of their expenses. And I was very impressed with the spreadsheets that they had. And I mean, and I love having detailed spreadsheets. I'm like, I know that if you're doing that and you're saying I carried this $4.32 over to the next week, that is impressive. And so when I see that kind of stuff, I knew that they were really keeping up with every dollar, every penny, and they were very, very mindful and intentional with their money. But one thing that I noticed is, I mean, they had groceries listed out, and would go back through, they would have their projection of what it was going to be, and then their comparison of what they actually spent. And they always tried to spend less than what that projection was. And they came in pretty good at that. And then that leftover money, they were rolling over to the next month to pay on different things. But one thing I didn't notice on there that really shot a red flag out was an emergency fund. And I said, what are you going to do? We'll just say his name's Bob. Bob, what are you going to do if something happens? And he said, well, if I can just keep paying on this card and this loan, and then once I get those paid off in like 8 months, then I'll have a little bit more wiggle room. But the interest rates, and they were pretty high interest rates. They were in the 20s. But he said, I just can't justify putting money in a savings account that's earning diddly, and that is an official financial term, diddly on a savings account when I could be saving myself, 25%. And so it just doesn't make sense to me until he had a car issue. And what had happened, because he was bounced, like up to the limit on his credit cards. And whenever you get in that situation, then that credit utilization that we've talked about before with debt management, and we will go over next month in debt management, that credit utilization, when you're up that high, over that 30% mark for your cards, with when you look at limits versus balances, it puts it if it's over that 30%, it's going to lower your credit score. It's going to raise your credit utilization. And when you have a lower score, what tends to happen? You don't get offered as much stuff. And so what happened with that, because of that higher credit utilization, they had reduced the limits on his cards. Now, they weren't charging him, the over limit fee because they had lowered the limit on it. But it was like every time he would pay money on it, he was still at the limit. So it was like, let's say that it started with 2,500. Now he's paid it down to 2,400. That's his new limit, 2,400. So they would kind of track it like that. So he really didn't have any wiggle room there. And so he ended up having a car issue, and I can't remember what exactly it was, but I think it ended up running him like $300. And he was able to, between the cards, kind of cash advance enough out that, because they give you can usually make a charge of about $100 or $200 on a card, even if you're kind of close to that max. And he had to go take out and use every card he could, which then now he has cash advance fees, and he has a higher interest rate on those. And so he was like, man, if I had listened. And, over just $300, that made such a big difference to him. So even starting out with that, we usually, just say, even with a new person, like someone that's just starting off and trying to pay debt down, and just try to save up $500, at least do 500, because you'd be surprised at how much that can be used. It may not pay for, all your medical bills, but it certainly can get you by with maybe a car repair or, a flat tire that you have to have repaired. That's not
otherwise you just get stuck in the same cycle. You just keep going back and back.
And we see that when we look at people that are, resort to payday loans. Those payday loan interest rates are so high, some of them almost 100%. And so you just see that cycle where you're just able to pay the interest on that and not really making any headway on the principal. And you just stay in that whirlpool. It's very hard to get out of it. So we know why, but how much should we save? And does anyone want to just throw out the rule of thumb that we usually hear? Anyone?
The 10%?
Oh,
6 months.
6 months is one.
Oh,
10%.
you're looking at months. Okay.
Yeah. 6 months is kind of the rule of thumb that most financial people will mention. And that's 6 months of non-discretionary expenses. So that's like your food, clothing, shelter. And with food, that's like, what can I get by on? Not the Chilean sea bass that I like, or lobster tail or anything like that. But yeah, just how much can you get by with? You can cancel Netflix, you can cancel Hulu, you can cancel Disney Plus, all those things, but you really can't cancel your house payment. They don't look kindly on that. They often will gig you on it. And so there's certain things that you can cancel and bypass where others you cannot. So we definitely want to make sure that we cover those non-discretionary expenses. Now, if you have a household that has dual income, we can, at very minimum, we try to look at 3 months for that, because you have that other income that can supplement if one of you aren't working. Now, what we saw happened in 2020, we had people in that situation where they had about 3 months worth, and they're like, no, we definitely, even though we had 2 households, we still had to have 6 months, because it wasn't someone got hurt or someone got laid off. It was like everyone got laid off. And so we had situations with that as well. And so usually we would like to see 6 months worth of non-discretionary expenses, at least 3 months for dual households. But some people just kind of look at that and say, okay, let me round it up. I would be good with 5,000 or 10,000 or 20,000 or whatever that number is that makes them feel warm and gushy inside. And that's fine too. Some people are a little bit more risk adverse. And so they will want to have that bigger fluff, where some others may be more risk tolerant. And they're like, I can do this, and I anticipate I can, do something else to generate this money. And that's fine, whatever you feel comfortable with. One thing that we look at with that too is your emergency fund is kind of two separate emergency funds. You have the emergency fund that's really going to pay for things like, paying for your house payment. And this isn't so much if you're retired already, but more if you're working and bringing in income, versus living off the retirement, because you can always tap in a little bit higher on the retirement if you need to. But if you're still working, and bringing in that income, you have to have that income for those expenses, those non-discretionary expenses, but you're also wanting to save and have that safety net for, like appliances in the house, and maybe a new roof or new HVAC system or something to that effect, to where, I can have this pot of money. And you don't necessarily have to have multiple pots of money. Like, this is the car emergency fund, this is the appliance emergency fund, this is so you can just have, what about is this going to cost me, worst case, and know that odds are, which last year we saw odds don't always work in our favor, odds are all of those things aren't going to happen at once. So what do you feel comfortable with? If a new roof and a new HVAC and maybe, a new appliances are going to run upwards at one time, 20,000, maybe, is that enough of an emergency fund for you for that type of stuff, and still be able to, have a little bit on the side for maybe those other things like paying for the house payment if you're still working.
And I think you can also look at, if you're doing, you could probably have some fun with a spreadsheet like Michelle likes. But if you know that your magic number that you came up with for what you want to save for appliances, and you get to that point, maybe that's a line item that you just keep on your budget, and you keep putting, you might still put it into the big bucket of emergency fund and appliances, but that it may shift, just kind of keep an eye on it, but just keep that line item where it's just almost a constant savings, and then maybe you could flip it over at some point.
Yeah, because it's definitely not if it's going to happen, it's when something's going to happen. And I mean, you can have the 20-year roof or 30-year roof or whatever they do them for now. I think mine does. I think we got the thicker plank, whatever it's called, planks, shingles up there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we got the thicker ones, and they were like, yeah, you can like drop this ball and hit, and it's not going to dent up. Who's going to do that? Who does that kind of stuff? But it's supposed to last a lot longer. We made sure that we, on our HVAC system, we had the 10-year warranty on it when we came. So, we knew that if we had that kind of safety net there, that it should be covered, that we didn't need to really direct so much at those areas. But we did know that if anything came out of those coffers, then we needed to refill them as well. And so we just, like, for my personal situation, I have a $20,000 kind of goal to have as an emergency fund. I know if my roof needs to be repaired, even though it's new, if I need new appliances, if I need a new HVAC system, if I have a car repair, if I have a medical issue that I need to pay out of pocket, all that stuff's going to be covered within that. But I have also some things set aside, and in my Roth account, I had a Roth account set up years ago, and I kind of was putting money into that when I could, and started doing some conversions as well. And so I know that if I have that too, I can kind of hybrid that, because, if you're under the age of 59 and a half, I can, usually with a IRA, if you need that money, you're going to end up, you're going to end up being, penalized on that. And so there's an automatic 10% penalty, plus you're going to get hit with the taxes owed on it.
For
And
a regular IRA.
yes, for a regular traditional IRA. But if I have money in a Roth account, I can gain access to those contributions penalty free.
And that kind of reduces the stress of like Bob had of, I can't justify putting this money away when I have this debt. Well, if you're putting it away and you know that, hey, if it's not being used for your debt right now, it may be used for your retirement if you don't have
Exactly.
It's still growing in that way. So and I know that, well, yeah, you have the where to put it now.
Yeah, where to put it, because and we typically recommend this for people that are starting out, that they're like, well, we need to establish an emergency fund. We would like to take advantage of, compound interest of some sort. And so, we know with that time is your friend with that. So if they're younger, we definitely, if they fall within those income limits, the Roth is a really good idea for a lot of those, because it does serve those two purposes, that if they do need it, they can access it. But if they don't need it, then they can continue to have it grow and just know that they can access it if they need to. And we often see that when people are saving for college too, for their kids. They may save that in a Roth account, and then whatever's not used, whereas like a 529 plan, if it's not used on higher education or educational expenses, then you're going to get taxed on that. Whereas on the Roth, you won't. If they don't use it all, it's yours. And
Well,
so that's kind of neat.
In this case, as long as you know that it's still supposed to be your emergency fund. If your kid's ready to go to college and that's your emergency fund, and you have to have another idea if you're maxed out on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can't promise the same thing to two different two different places. So it's important to make sure that you really tag that. And I know Susie Orman has a pretty common phrase or a quote that says, "Never invest emergency savings in the stock market." And I think we were talking about that yesterday, Tina, when we said, a lot of Roth accounts you will want to invest in because you do have that longevity of time there, so you can have it grow. But you had mentioned like a money market fund. And, is that a pretty safe thing? Because usually money market funds typically pay more than what a savings account will at a bank or credit union. And that may be, I know that in years past they really did, but you said, well, you can't lose on that, right? And I said, yeah, not usually, but I think it was like September 2008, maybe, I think is when we pulled up the date. It did actually drop below $1. And so that was something that we call breaking the buck. If that money market account drops below that dollar value, and we did see it at 97 cents, it didn't stay there long. It bounced back up. But, even with something like that, you think is pretty safe, it can lose some money too. So where you want to place that, I mean, we drive to work knowing that we have a risk of getting in a car accident, but the odds are kind of in our favor that usually we're going to get to work okay every day, and we're going to get home every day. So I think taking whatever level of risk you're comfortable with, I wouldn't say, put it all in Bitcoin from the Roth account, but I think that depending on how much you have in there is going to make a big difference too. So if you've been contributing quite a bit and you have let's say you have just a $5,000 balance in there, then maybe not invest so much of that. You may want to build up more before you say, okay, my goal is to have 10,000. I now have 25,000. For this 10,000, that's going to be, my magic number. And I'm going to leave that in something a little more safe-ish. And then the other portion of that, you may be able to invest in some other things that will kind of give you a little bit more growth and stay up with inflation a little bit better. And usually that's where you see that, or with stocks, you're going to have to invest in some equities really to keep up with inflation.
So going back to the idea of the money market fund, which I had to get clarification from you that's different than a money market savings account. Right?
There's and I think that gets a little confusing. There's money
Yeah.
market accounts, and then there's money market mutual funds as well. So those are a little bit different. And a mutual fund works just like a mutual fund. It just has some money market stuff in there. But yeah, basically like just a straight up old fashioned plain Jane money market fund works pretty much like a savings account. So you
Okay.
put money in, it doesn't really do anything. It's invested in this one thing. And then with the money market mutual fund, there's different things in there. But so I think what you were talking about yesterday was the straight up plain Jane vanilla money market account. And that's the one we were talking about that did dip below
Okay.
in 2008 to that 97 cent deal. And it can happen. I mean, you can see that was well over 10 years ago that it happened. And
Right.
I didn't look at like every single time it happened, but I don't think it's happened since then. I would be, I didn't research that enough, so I don't know. But I mean, it can, but it didn't stay there for a terribly long amount of time. And we have to look at not just one incident ever in however many years back in historical, but you have to look at what are the odds of that happening too. And just like if I'm driving to work, people get in car wrecks every single day. People die in car wrecks every day. Now it doesn't mean that I'm what is that, agoraphobia, that where you stay home.
You don't want to leave your house.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't, although I'm becoming much more introvert than I used to be. But yeah, with working at home, I still get out, but I don't get out as much. But it doesn't just be that fear of getting in a car wreck doesn't like turn it all into something different. So I think that's where you have to look at is, historically the odds are this, and that's where you can kind of gauge that a little bit better. What are you willing to risk? And even with a bank, I mean, yeah, you can, they have some FDIC limits and insurance on that stuff, but even with the bank, what if something goes under? It may take you some time to get to it if they don't get bailed out.
Okay. Boy,
Lots of stuff, huh?
lots of stuff. Does anybody have any questions or anything you want to comment on about emergency funds and being prepared for the unexpected? I know that last year we just couldn't have. You can't expect this kind of thing,
No.
and so it is unprecedented. And I think giving yourself grace when things like that happen, and yeah, you can be prepared for a lot of things, but some things you just can't. And that's when you have an understanding of all these things that it really can help. Or if you know somebody who can help you, that's all. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think last year kind of scared a lot of people into submission, if you will. A lot of people weren't doing, they're like, oh, we'll do a budget next. We know we need to do it. We'll get to it. Let's plan that for next weekend. And it kind of keeps getting kicked down the road. And we had such an influx of calls last year with people really, wanting to, okay, we've been putting this off for a very long time and we need to see where we're at now. Because if something like this happens again, and we have 2 consecutive years or 3 consecutive years, and what are the ripple effects of this? We hit some things that we've never hit before. And so what is this going to do to the economy over the next, so many years? And what is this going to do to the stock market over the next many years? And interest rates, we saw, interest rates on houses drop to, they were basically paying you to, to take a loan on a house. And so we saw incredibly low interest rates. And I think Gary mentioned before, when he first bought his house, back years ago, it was, upwards of like 12, 14% for a house. And I'm like, you can get a credit card, unsecured credit card, for cheaper than that interest rate. And I know when my parents first got their house, when I was a child, that I remember them talking about those high rates. And I also remember my grandparents talking about, CDs paying 12 to 15%. And that's where, we've seen those highs, and then we've seen, where they're, here, come get a house loan for zero and 0% APR. And it was just so ridiculously low that we did see a lot of people refinancing. But what kind of hiccuped some of those is if they didn't have emergency funds put back and they were laid off and they couldn't make payments, then it could have had a pretty sizable dink on their credit. And or if they didn't have that sizable, 6 months or 10,000 or whatever dollar amount you want to use, if they didn't have that, they resorted to using credit cards. And we saw a lot of credit reports or credit scores going down a bit because of that credit utilization. And so we've had a few people calling in, a few more than normal, calling in and saying that, how do I raise my credit score now? What can I do to, bounce this back up? And should I consolidate? And, what should I do with all of this? And so we have people that it affected many areas of their life. It took some of their emergency fund. They may have had to dip into their Roth, retirement funds. They may have lost their job or had reduction of hours and really had to consolidate a lot of things and really get mindful about where those funds, those dollars are being spent. And now they're like, okay, if it was just one piece, like if we had to revamp a budget, it's okay. But now it's affected so many things. And it's like, what do I start? Where do I start? I know after, cooking Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner, I'm usually the one doing most of the cooking. And when it comes to everyone, you cook all day and then they just kind of run through, and within 3 minutes, everyone's fully fed and getting dessert, right? And then you're stuck looking at the mess thinking, oh, where do I start? And that's where I think a lot of people, were this past year, is that so many things were just so messed up that they didn't know. Should I work on my credit score? Should I replenish my retirement fund? Should I, increase my emergency fund? Should I, what do I start on? And I think that was the hardest part, because there were so many things that were going on at once.
Right. Did you have anything, question for us, Walter? I thought I might have heard you start talking. It's hard because I can't see you.
This has been great.
And I know this is stuff we've covered. And I know if you get our newsletters or our e-newsletter, this is stuff we hammer on a lot. And it's kind of like, if we do it enough, people will listen, type of thing. And obviously not our clients, because all of our clients listen fantastically. But with those types of things, the more that we hear it, the more common it comes to us, the more, the more that we're thinking about it, and the more likely we are to act on that and to really realize that it's a pretty important thing.
Next time we will be talking about mindful debt management. So